Well, good day, friends, or good evening, or if you're looking at me right now, you might think it's good night. Let me fix that for you. Yes, welcome to another Word of Gord. Average folks in the afterlife, I think it's 48. And as I said in the last one, we're going to move on to something slightly different from the historical spiritualism we explored there, 1915, 1930. And I want to focus on a recent therapy called induced after-death communication. Now, ADC is a common term for people who either spontaneously or through meditation feel communication with a deceased loved one. And this is where a therapist induces that state of mind or that state of consciousness where after-death communication seems to be possible. And the book is by Alan Botkin. I think I have the first edition here, but I'm pretty sure there's a new one, 2005, but I'm sure I saw a new one just advertised not that long ago. And Induced After-Death Communication, a new therapy for healing grief and trauma. Now, the reason I'm focusing on this is we see so many war vets suffering PTSD and winding up in suicide or in murder. And one here in Canada where I live, just about 3 days ago, murdered his entire family. The same day, I think the day after, he went to try and get some help at one of those clinics where they try to help soldiers and others. Anyway, I don't know the whole story, but just to bring it right up to date, it's happening all the time. And Alan Botkin seems to have been working some years ago in a Veterans Administration hospital, and he was generally using a technique developed by someone else to help reduce trauma and grief. Now, let me just give a brief description of that. EMDR. In the late 1980s, psychologist Francine Shapiro discovered a radical new therapy technique she named eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR. In EMDR therapy, the psychotherapist, usually sitting before and slightly to the side of the patient, moves his or her hand with the index and next finger extended left and right in front of the patient on the same level as the patient's eyes. While focusing on the psychotherapist's hand and keeping the head stationary so only the eyes move left and right rhythmically, the patient attends to a disturbing thought, feeling, sensation, or image. During a set of eye movements, the patient experiences a spontaneous, natural reprocessing of the thought, feeling, sensation, or image. After a number of sets of eye movements, patients typically report psychological breakthroughs that normally would take months to achieve. The procedure is now being used for a wide variety of disorders, from multiple personality disorder to the post-traumatic stress disorders I worked with. And he goes on to say how well this works. And so I don't think anyone's... and there's a page where he describes several practitioners saying, it's not hypnosis. It's something slightly different. You can read the book yourself. I don't want to get into a lot of theorizing. What I want to get is how he moved from EMDR into induced after-death communication. It seems to be just an extension of that, and maybe doing it longer, or doing it for 5 minutes, then a break, then another 5 minutes. Taking people to another level of consciousness bit by bit, which reminds me of doing past life regressions when you do an induction and the patient isn't quite deep enough. So you do a further induction, take them a little deeper. And if you're not too careful, you take them too far. I did that quite recently with a person who was experiencing a past life and quite detailed and vividly, and then asked to be taken a little deeper so she could experience it more vividly. which I did take her deeper. And then after a while, she started channeling a completely other spirit, not a past life, but a spirit. Anyway, it's a long story, but it's very easy to do. The levels of consciousness are very subtle and subtly different from each other, and you have to proceed slowly and carefully through them. And it's something we all learn in this work. But here's where he discovers how he can move from one to the other. On the day I first discovered the induced after-death communication phenomenon, I was in a psychotherapy session with Sam. I handed him a box of Kleenex as tears trailed down his face, dropping from his chin to his shirt. I had worked from Sam, a 46-year-old patient at the VA hospital, on other traumatic memories of his Vietnam War experience, but he had avoided bringing up this one because it was too painful. While in Vietnam, he had developed a close relationship with Lee, a 10-year-old orphaned Vietnamese girl. She had made Sam's base camp her home after both her parents were killed. She helped with the daily chores on the base and in return was given food, shelter, and companionship. The other American soldiers watched out for her, but Sam and Lee developed a special relationship. Lee reminded Sam of his two younger sisters, helping him maintain a sense of his own humanity in the dehumanizing brutality of war. Each time Sam's unit returned from his patrols in the jungle, Lee would pick him out of the group, run to him, and give him a hug. Other soldiers in Sam's unit became accustomed to seeing them together talking about their lives before they met. Lee particularly enjoyed hearing his stories about life in America. After several months, Sam decided to adopt Lee and bring her home. Orders came from headquarters, however, that all orphaned Vietnamese children on the base were to be sent to a Catholic orphanage in a distant village. Sam was devastated. A few days later, Sam, in tears, helped load Lee and other orphaned Vietnamese children onto a flatbed truck. Just as they got all the children onto the truck, shots rang out and bullets zipped past the truck. Risking their lives, Sam and other soldiers quickly pulled the children off the truck to the relative safety of the ground. The shooting stopped as quickly as it started, and they began to put the children back on the truck. Nearly all of the children were back on the truck when Sam realized he didn't see Lee. He walked to the back of the truck and saw her lying face down with a spot of blood in her back. Sam rolled her over and was horrified to see that her front torso was blown apart from a bullet that had entered her back. Sam sat on the ground holding her lifeless body and cried. Other soldiers eventually had to pull them away and take Lee's body to bury her. The incident was Sam's psychological undoing. For the remainder of his tour in Vietnam, he numbed the pain of his profound loss with anger and rage, volunteering for dangerous patrols to kill any enemy he could find or be killed himself. After Vietnam, he returned to the States and fathered a daughter, but then avoided her for years because she triggered anger, guilt, and deep sadness over Lee's death, and gruesome images of Lee's dead body. For nearly 28 years, he spent most of his days secluded in the basement of his home, separated physically and psychologically from his family. 28 years, my goodness. To help him open up and work through the grief that was dominating his life, I decided to use core-focused EMDR. Sam sobbed quietly from the overwhelming pain of his grief, and I asked him to focus on his sadness while I administered the first set of eye movements. As I expected, the sadness that had held him isolated in grief for 28 years increased notably. I gave him more sets of eye movements, and his sadness began to decrease. While tears ran down his face, I administered a final eye movement procedure and asked him to close his eyes. Neither of us was prepared for what happened next. The tears that had been flowing from his closed eyes suddenly stopped, and he smiled broadly. He giggled, too. When he opened his eyes, he was euphoric. When I closed my eyes, I saw Lee as a beautiful woman with long black hair and a white gown surrounded by radiant light. She seemed genuinely happier and more content than anyone I have ever known. Sam's tear-reddened face glowed. She thanked me for taking care of her before she died. I said, "I love you, Lee," and she said, "I love you too, Sam." And she put her arms around me and embraced me. And then she faded away. Sam was ecstatic and absolutely convinced he had just communicated with Lee. "I could actually feel her arms around me," he proclaimed. As Sam's psychologist, I wasn't sure to make of what he was telling me. I assumed that the agony of his grief had somehow produced a hallucination based on fantasy or wishful thinking. I had never witnessed or heard of such a response during psychotherapy. After Sam left my office on that day, the image of his smile showing through his tears and his assertive statement that he felt he had communicated with Lee played repeatedly in my mind. I sat in the quiet of my office trying to understand what had happened. Sam experienced a grief hallucination, I thought. I'd heard of these, but it wasn't sufficient to explain what I had witnessed. The creativity had been remarkable. I had not seen that spontaneous imagination in any patient, and had never read anything similar in the literature. If that was a hallucination, then his mind has miraculously created an experience that was completely healing. During my clinical rotations on wards with the chronic and severely mentally ill, no patient had ever reported a hallucination that was so positive and healing. Something in Sam flowered in an instant, without direction from me, reversing the sadness in which he was immersed, and brought him a notable feeling of release from intrusive images, anxiety, and depression that had consumed him for 28 years. I left the VA hospital building that day still puzzled by what had happened. I wondered whether I would ever in my professional career see such a remarkable scene again. Probably not, I thought. Sam's experience was one of those events a psychotherapist would see once in a professional lifetime, and I could just file it away as a one-time aberration. But I also felt concerned that if Sam had hallucinated, the intense stress of his traumatic memories had somehow compromised his ability to differentiate reality from fantasy. That worried me. Then he, fighting with his doubt and his rationale analysis, his professional analysis, he moves on to intentionally inducing an IADC, and discusses how it's similar to near-death experiences and after-death communications. And let's go on to when he's fully involved in the work and see the different type of clients, all of whom have brief but meaningful experiences of loved ones in the afterlife. Would we assume that the loved ones know that this is about to happen? I suspect so, after seeing and reading some of these cases, and I think you will too. Now, whether it's them themselves or their spirit guides, spirit guides are very good at this sort of a thing. For example, Sam's spirit guide would sense or know that this was probably going to happen, and would know from being with him for 28 odd years what a torment it was for him, and how healing it would be if he could get the spirit of Lee to appear. And the spirit of Lee had probably been aware of his pain and more than willing to help. And I suspect that's what happened. Anyway, Sally's case. This is sometime further on. I just cry for no reason, Sally wept, clutching a wet handkerchief. Her depression wasn't responding to medication, so she referred to me. As we talked, it became clear she was deeply in grief over her father's death 5 years ago. She had stayed by his side for months while the cancerous growth on the side of his neck grew, sapping his life away day after painful day. She wept bitterly. The images of her father dying with a cancerous growth on her neck wouldn't leave her. When she was ready, I used EMDR to reduce her overwhelming sadness and the pain of the images. After the sadness had decreased, I initiated the IADC procedure and asked her to close her eyes and go with whatever happened. The first induction did not result in an IADC. On the second induction, however, after a moment with her eyes still closed, she said, "I can see him. He looks healthy again. He looks happy." She paused and smiled. "Grandma and Grandpa are with him, and 2 of my aunts, and my uncle who died long ago." She paused, gazing inward. "They're partying, laughing. Oh, they're enjoying themselves." Then a room filled with bright white light. She opened her eyes and looked at me. "I could somehow feel their happiness," she said excitedly. "I was wishing I could be with my father, and I don't mean suicide. I just wanted to be with him now, but I know I can't." I started another IADC procedure while she held that thought in mind. The same scene came back, but there was more. He walked right up to me and said he was still with me in a very important way, that I should continue to take care of my children, and that he would come for me when it was my time. She smiled warmly through her tears. When Sally left my office that day, all her grief and pain over the death of her father were gone. As she was leaving, she said, "That was absolutely amazing. As soon as I felt I was reconnected with them, my sadness vanished. I know that was really them. I have to tell my brother about this. I know he'll think I'm a raving lunatic, but I don't care. I feel great." And that is an emotion reaction that is repeated throughout the book. Some have questioned my observation that grief completely resolves in this way after an IADC. They point out that if someone's child dies, even a loving IADC reconnection will not keep the patient from feeling a profound sense of sadness at times. I agree that an IADC experience does not substitute for those shared experiences that can never come to be. Those losses are, however, secondary to the primary loss. My child is gone. She's completely disconnected from me. After IADCs, people have suffered tragic losses no longer feel disconnected. Although they still experience the more secondary feelings of loss on occasions such as birthdays and anniversaries, the sadness at those times is much more readily tolerated because the bereaved doesn't feel the deep and more painful sadness associated with a sense of complete disconnection. Peter's case. Peter was narcissistic. He needed everything to center on him. At the time he came to see me, he was wanting help coping with his wife's death, which had just occurred 2 days before our session. He explained to me what had happened. He and his wife had just finished dinner when she stood uneasily and said to him, "I don't feel well. I'm going to go out for some air." She walked outside and stood before the long flight of steps that led from the porch to the street, hoping to feel better. A moment later, Peter heard the sound of his wife falling down the stairs. He ran outside into his hot, saw her lying motionless at the bottom of the stairs. He ran down to her breathless and realized she was unconscious with a large gash on her head. He called 911 and hurried back to her to wait. When the paramedics arrived, he felt they were getting out of the ambulance too slowly. "My God, my wife is dying. Can't you hurry? Do something quick." When they arrived at the hospital, she was pronounced dead on arrival. He was filled with rage at the paramedics, believing they could have saved her. After he told me the story, he sat in my office enraged, crying, and on the verge of collapse. I used EMDR to help him calm himself. As I expected, the rage gradually changed to deep sadness. The sadness mounted until he was sobbing and shaking his head. Then it started to subside. I used 2 more sets of eye movements, and IADC experience began while his eyes were closed. "I can see my wife," he said. "She's beautiful. She's radiant, surrounded by white light." After a moment, he opened his eyes. "She told me not to be angry with the paramedics. She said she was dead by the time she hit the bottom of the stairs." His tone became agitated. Then she started telling me what to do with the kids. Do this, do that. I wanted her to talk to me about my feelings, not the kids. Peter's narcissism required that people focus on his needs, not anyone else's. I said, "Okay, let's go back into it, and you can tell her how you're feeling. Let's do another set of eye movements." We did another set. He closed his eyes and sat quietly for a minute. When he opened his eyes, he explained. She said, "It's okay. You'll get over it with time. It's okay." She also said for me to stay away from the new business venture I was about to begin, and something else. Her father was there. He died years ago. Why was he there? Why don't you ask him? We had another set of eye movements, and Peter closed his eyes. After a few seconds, he opened and explained. He said, "I'm here because we are together now. That's the relationship we always had. I'm here because I love my daughter. We do what we always have done." Peter was still sad about his wife's death and wondered why. We agreed he would go back to the scene and ask his father-in-law why he was still feeling sad. I had him do a set of eye movements while he thought about his father-in-law. He went back into the experience and asked his father-in-law, "Why do I still feel so sad about this?" He reported that his father-in-law replied, "Because you still don't understand death, but in time you will." Peter reported that his wife was there and she said, "I love you and I will always be with you and the kids." Peter's IADC is an example of the fact that the patient's desires and psychological condition have no effect on the content of the IADC. If it had been imagination or wishful thinking, he would have, because of his narcissism, created a scene in which he was the center of attention. In fact, he experienced his wife being concerned about their children, not him, and his father-in-law was in the scene where he would have chosen to have his wife focus on him alone. Good point. Experiences that have pointed messages and advice. Wayne's case. Wayne came to see me because he had a recurring, intrusive feelings of guilt about an incident that happened in Vietnam during his tour. I should mention later in the book there are vets from World War II in Korea and Iraq. These ones all seem to be in Vietnam. Just a small point. Wayne had developed a close relationship with a soldier who came from the same town in Pennsylvania where he'd grown up, although he hadn't known him before. They spent time together sharing stories about familiar places in town and could often be heard laughing loudly about the oddities in the little mill town they both knew so well. One day on a mission to find a sniper they knew was in the wooded area close to the barracks, Wayne, his friend, and another soldier were walking through dense vegetation when they heard a sound. Wayne motioned to the other two soldiers to go forward and right while he circled left. A few minutes later a shot rang out and Wayne heard his friend call him, "Wayne, I'm hit!" He ran over to where his friend lay, now dead from a mortal chest wound. The other soldier walked out from the foliage and seeing the dead man said, "I didn't know it was him. I just saw something move and fired." He'd killed Wayne's friend accidentally. Wayne was enraged and told the soldier to leave them. He'd take care of his friend. The next day, Wayne and the soldier who had killed his friend were out searching for the same sniper. From the undergrowth, the sniper's bullet tore into the soldier's neck. Wayne saw the sniper and immediately shot him. Then he fell to his knees and held the soldier in his arms, looking at the wound. It was obviously fatal. The soldier asked Wayne to forgive him for killing his friend. Wayne said he forgave him, but he didn't mean it. He was still angry with the soldier for accidentally killing his friend. The soldier then died in his arms. Wayne finished telling me the story and said, "Doctor, I didn't really forgive him. I was still mad. I just said I forgave him because I knew he was dying." I asked Wayne to let himself feel his sadness for his friend while I administered a set of eye movements. Finally, his sadness increased to the point where he was unable to speak easily. "How sad are you feeling now?" "About a 10, he replied, referring to the 10-point scale we had been using to talk about sadness. "Okay, stay with the feeling and let's do the eye movements again." After more, his sadness started to decrease. I did one more set and told him, "Stay with that feeling and let whatever comes just come." He closed his eyes and sat quietly. Then I saw my friend from Pennsylvania. I saw him smiling at me. He looked real happy in a peaceful kind of way. He told me he has forgiven the guy that killed him because it was only a mistake. He said I should forgive him too. Wayne nodded his head slowly and looked at me intently. I can't explain it, but suddenly I feel like I've forgiven that guy for the first time in my life. How can that be? I've hated him every day for 28 years. Another 28 years. Wayne said he felt lighter after the session, like a huge burden had been lifted from him. 2 weeks later he met me, smiling and relieved. He immediately said, "I still feel like I've forgiven the guy and I don't feel bad about it at all. It's just like it's something that happened and it's over." Max's case. Being reunited with a loved one who has been missing for years is a joyous, life-changing experience for both people. The moment marks the beginning of new lives that will be fuller than they were. That joy can be extinguished, however, when somebody finally locates the long-lost child, parent, or sibling and learns that the loved one has passed away. The reunion will never happen. With IADC therapy, however, that sense of being reunited can still heal the patient's grief, even though the loved one has died. This is what Max learned. In the process, he had demonstrated a characteristic common to IADCs. Often the experience not only resolves grief, but provides the patient with a profoundly positive insight. Max came into my office because of his overwhelming feelings of guilt and sadness. He'd been married more than 23 years, but the marriage had been brief, He had been married more than 23 years before, but the marriage had been brief, failing after a short time. His wife left him, taking their infant son across the country and remarrying. Since Max was not in the child's life and her new husband wanted to become the child's father, she asked Max to give up all the custody rights and allow her new husband to adopt the child. "It was the hardest decision of my life," he said, "but I wanted my son to have a stable home, so I signed the papers." Max eventually remarried but never fathered any more children. His new wife had children, but he didn't feel like a father to them. He kept hoping that someday he would find his biological son and develop a relationship. One day Max answered the phone and heard the caller say, "You haven't seen me in a long time. I'm your son." His spirit soared as he listened to his son talk about his life. He said he and his mother, Max's ex-wife, weren't getting along and he wanted to leave home. He said he had always dreamed of living with his biological dad. Max was elated. His life dream was coming true. As soon as he hung up the phone, Max began planning how the two could meet and talk about arranging for his son to live with him. But when he called to finalize the arrangements, he learned that his son had committed suicide. Max was crushed. Now, 4 years later, Max had come for therapy to try and reduce the despondence. I used Core Focus EMDR to get in touch with his sadness, and when it began to diminish, I began the induction. Max closed his eyes and almost immediately started describing what he was seeing. "I can see my son and my dad fishing together in the most beautiful place I have ever seen. Dad has been dead for years. My son is asking Dad questions about me. Dad is telling him stories about me when I was growing up." He opened his eyes and said, "I think I know now why my son died. He had a higher calling, to be with the ones who really love him." He thought for a minute. I used to feel like I had been cheated because I didn't have my own son with me. But now I feel like I can give all my love to my stepchildren, just as Dad is giving his love to my son. I need to be more giving and less selfish." Well, well, well. Betty's case. Betty had a very close relationship with Hank, her father-in-law, before he died. She described him as a very gentle man with a heart of gold. After he retired, Hank would come daily to Betty's house to care for her two sons, his grandchildren, so Betty and her husband could pursue their professional careers. When Hank suddenly died of a heart attack, Betty and her husband were devastated. About 3 years later, Betty came to me for psychotherapy involving a problem not related to Hank. When the subject of her father-in-law's death came up during the course of therapy, it was clear she had residual sadness. I explained IADCs and asked her about whether she would like to participate in one to resolve her feelings about Hank's death. She laughed and said, "It won't work with me. I'm much better with his death now, and besides, I don't believe in that kind of stuff anyway." But she was willing to give it a try. Her sadness was not overwhelming, but it increased somewhat with a set of eye movements. The next set brought it down, and I began the induction. Betty closed her eyes and almost immediately said, "I can see him. It's Hank. He looks 20 years younger than when he died. And he's thoroughly at peace and completely happy." She paused again for a few seconds, then opened her eyes. "He told me he's proud of me and my husband. But something really interesting happened then. Hank's sister appeared. She died about 7 years before Hank, I think. She said, 'Tell my daughter I'm okay.'" Betty then told me that not only was she surprised at the communication with her father-in-law, she was very confused by the fact that Hank's sister had appeared during the experience. Betty explained to me that she had met Hank's sister on one occasion at a family reunion. She didn't know her well and didn't know her daughter at all. Betty was euphoric and confused. She ended her session by saying, "I never would have believed it, but that was really Hank. I still don't know why his sister was there. I certainly didn't expect that. And how the hell am I going to tell her daughter that her mother's okay? She'll think I'm a total nutcase. I didn't make this shit up, doctor. It just happened." Betty's case is common among people who have experienced IADCs. Her experience was not at all consistent with her beliefs and expectations. She was not only surprised she had an IADC, but she was also startled by the appearance of Hank's sister, which she clearly believed was not of her making. It is not unusual for the patient to describe the deceased being with someone who was important to the deceased in life, but relatively unknown and unimportant to the patient. Jason's case. Jason had been a chopper pilot in Vietnam during the war. One day when he was scheduled to fly a routine mission, he was feeling very ill and asked a young chopper pilot new to the war to fly the mission for him. The young soldier was eager to prove his capability, so he happily agreed to take over the mission while Jason spent the day on his cot. That afternoon, Jason's commanding officer woke to tell him that his chopper had crashed and burned. All on board were lost, including the substitute pilot. The impact was crushing. He felt intense sadness and tremendous guilt that this young pilot had been killed. He believed that he was the one who should have died. The guilt and grief he felt for the young pilot remained intense over the years. Jason told me the story sternly, but the quiver in his chin and stiff posture revealed that he was suppressing deep sadness and guilt. I asked him how he was feeling, and he said, "Well, fair," and looked away with a sigh. I explained the EMDR to him and administered the first set of eye movements. "What are you feeling?" I asked. He opened his eyes and spoke. "Oh, not so good." He began to sob. "Stay with that feeling and we'll do the eye movements again." An EMDR psychotherapist would stop at this point and have the patient imagine being in a safe place to reduce the patient's distress. But I knew that stopping the process would just leave deeply seated emotional issues in place to haunt him. I did another set of eye movements and he closed his eyes. Then it happened. He was openly crying when he first closed his eyes, but he suddenly stopped crying and craned his head forward as though looking and listening. After a minute of silence, he opened his eyes wide and looked at me. "I saw him," he said. "I saw that young guy. He was standing over his own body, feeling real worried about how his family back home was going to take it." He turned his face away for a moment, remembering. I could see his body. It was mangled and burned, but there he was, just as real as you and me, standing perfectly healthy, looking at it. Then the guy looked at me. He said, "It's not at all your fault. I wanted to make that flight. You shouldn't feel responsible. I'm okay with it." Then he relaxed and was smiling. "Just let whatever happens happen," I said. We did some more eye movements. Then he said, "This time I just saw the guy. He was looking at me and I could tell what he was saying, but I didn't hear the words. He said his family is doing fine. His wife has remarried and he's happy about that." He laughed. He even made a joke. He said, "It's better to die the first week in country than the last week." He said, "I got out of 12 more miserable months in Nam." Oh dear. Now here's one where he's training another therapist to do the work. Hania Stromberg, a spontaneous ADC before a client's IADC. Several weeks after her training, Hania called me excitedly. "Al, this is unbelievable. I just had the experience of hearing my patient's father while he was having an IADC. This is the account of what happened. Arnold came to me because he was feeling grief over his father's death. His mother had died years earlier, and he and his father lived together until his father's death. His father was a star athlete who excelled at sports in high school and college. It seemed that he was successful at every sport he tried. In spite of his success in sports and later business, he said his father felt disappointment in life. Arnold was very sad about his relationship with his father because he felt his father had not really wanted him. His father developed Alzheimer's near the end of his life, and Arnold placed him in a nursing home. That caused tremendous guilt from a sense he was simply adding to his father's disappointment with life. He acknowledged that his father was not conscious of where he was during that time, but he still felt guilt for not being able to keep his father at home. During the EMDR eye movements, I felt what seemed to me like someone entering the room, and I said, "Oh, a strong presence just entered the room." Arnold replied, "Yes, I felt the same thing. My father is here." He closed his eyes. In my mind, I heard a male voice saying, "My son, my dear, dear son," but I didn't share that with the patient. After that, I closed my eyes for a few seconds and saw moving purple swirls. After a moment, he opened his eyes and described his experience. He said he felt like he was floating and seeing profiles in shadow that looked like his father floating around him. He then said, "I saw the profiles in swirling waves of purple." In the following session, he reported that he had felt blissful for a day after the last session. He had come to feel less guilt and more love for his father. I did the IDDC preparation, and after the set of eye movements, Arnold closed his eyes and described what he was seeing. "I see a lot of men in the 1950s clothing, very professional and clean cut. He sat quietly for about 10 minutes. Then he opened his eyes with a smile and told me, I saw Dad and we talked about life. I asked him whether the woman I'm seeing would be a good match for me. He said, No, no, my son, my dear, dear son. She's not good for you. I noticed he reported his father saying the exact words I had heard at the previous session, which Arnold had not heard during that session. I asked him, You said your father said to you, my son, my dear, dear son. Did he say that to you before? Oh, yes, Arnold replied. He said that to me often when he was alive, and I heard him saying it again today. Anyway, lots more from that book. Induced After Death Communication, Alan Botkin. And the new edition will likely have a different color on the cover. But, you know, you've got the name, so what the heck. So, certainly that reminded me of some of the spirit contacts I've done as a psychic medium, where I'm not using that technique at all. I'm just operating as a psychic. And certainly I've connected, you know, living people with their deceased loved ones who actually, they're not quite as loved as you might hope. Relationships between fathers and daughters that need quite a bit of healing. And people get angry with each other, and people ask for forgiveness, and that sort of a thing. And it can be rough because you're basically in the middle of a family argument where someone's still miffed at what happened years ago, and the other one who's in the afterlife is sort of, you know, taking off their hat and bowing and, you know, begging for forgiveness. And sometimes the one that, you know, the client that's come to see me is reluctant to give that forgiveness. And I mean, they eventually do, but it's a tussle. Anyway, I think that's a great therapy, and I don't know if you have to like have a license to do it, but it sounds pretty simple to me. And knowing the way that things go in psychology and psychotherapy, you likely do need to have a license. They're very good at sort of setting up walls around their, you know, their practice. They remind me of past life regressionists that think you got to have a degree in it or go to some school and learn to do it. And, you know, after having, you know, spent $10,000 learning to do it, they want everyone else to learn, spend that kind of money, when actually all you have to do is be sensitive and understand the various levels of consciousness, which you can do from personal practice and meditation. Anyway, a small thought on professionalism and snobbery and elitism in the New Age movement. And talking about psychotherapists, this has never been, I've never talked about this before, but I have once channeled a dead psychotherapist for a living psychotherapist who was looking for advice from a mentor. And we did this on several occasions with great success. And on the first attempt, my living client taped it, and she talked about, you know, shall we make this public, shall we not? And she wasn't sure. But very interesting to hear about a dead psychotherapist talking about doing psychotherapy on what I assumed was the lower or mid-astral, where people, many, many souls, still have many issues that they have not confronted, left over from the physical life, you know. And I thought, oh yeah, right, of course they're going to have that. Anyway, small point of interest to you all, and blessings wherever you are, whatever state of mind you're in, or whatever state of mind you're going to be in 10 minutes. Good luck with it.